because President Biden is going to be speaking. Was being presented there at the Maccabiah Games, Teddy Stadium in Jerusalem. Let's see if he says something.
He joins us with the Prime Minister, Yair Lapid of Israel, and they're greeted by Mr. Amir Peled, the chairman of the Maccabi.
There's U.S. President Joe Biden.
President Biden, we are so excited to have you with us here tonight.
גבירותיי ורבותיי, כבוד נשיא ארצות הברית, מר ג'ו ביידן, יחד עם נשיא מדינת ישראל, מר יצחק הרצוג, וכמובן ראש ממשלת ישראל, מר יאיר לפיד. הם מקבלים את פניו גם יושב ראש מכבי תנועה עולמית אמיר פלד, נשיא מכבי תנועה עולמית ג'ק טרפין, וראש עיריית ירושלים מר משה ליאון. הקהל מתבקש לעמוד.
Please rise, everybody.
Again, you're watching U.S. President Joe Biden there at the with Prime Minister Yair Lapid, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, at the opening of the Maccabiah Games, the Jewish Olympics in Jerusalem. You can see a packed crowd there as the athletes come in, and there might be remarks. We're not sure. Certainly, President Herzog is supposed to speak at some point during this opening ceremony, and we will bring you that live. Mark Regev, that's certainly a nice picture for Yair Lapid to have, having been on the job for, what is it now, 2-3 weeks?
That's all. That's correct. It is a good picture, and ultimately, Israeli voters want to see someone who's got defense and foreign affairs experience. And if you look at Yair Lapid's resume, you could say, a critic could say, that it's a bit lacking.
Well, they have said it, Mark.
and this visit, together with the visit last week to Paris to see Macron, but this is obviously much more important, to be embraced this way by the American president can, he hopes, help him. But I'd remind you that there was a similar visit by an American president in 1996 when Bill Clinton came and embraced Shimon Peres, who was then the embattled Labour Prime Minister, and it really didn't help him. Ultimately, Israeli voters will vote for all sorts of reasons. I think this helps Lapid's image, maybe as a statesman, where he hasn't been seen in the past this way. But to say this can be a game changer, I think that's probably overstating it.
I'd even go further because, Chuck, we saw the previous president, Donald Trump, do even significant policy moves to try to help Benjamin Netanyahu. For example, the U.S. recognizing sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and ultimately that did not lead to him being able to win in multiple elections.
Well, I mean, I agree with Mark that this probably isn't a game changer. But remember, the elections are so close. We're talking 1 or 2 seats either way are going to make the entire difference. And a visit like this, when a president of the United States visits any country, certainly in Israel, the impact really is huge. Maybe it could give Lapid that seat or two that he needs.
Right, and of course these elections really depend even on just on a seat or two. That's how close the split is between those, basically 4 against former Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's President Joe Biden being waved at. Of course, early in the day, he received a rare...
From the United States of America, say hello to your president.
There they go. We're just going to watch this for a second. The U.S. delegation, young American Jewish athletes coming in, and they are greeting President Joe Biden. That's, of course, the biggest delegation. So as I was saying, earlier in the day, he received the honor at the president's house, the Israeli president's house, the Israeli President Medal of Freedom. Let's go to our Bianca Zanini, who is outside Beit HaNasi, the president's house in Jerusalem. Bianca,
Hi, Calev. Certainly a day of meetings.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Continue, Bianca.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Go ahead.
Certainly a day of meetings and speeches and pats on the back and talks of future and cooperation. Here at the president's residence earlier today, Biden received the Medal of Honor from Israeli President Isaac Herzog. The two of them also had a one-on-one meeting where they talked about both their personal relationship and their personal connection connection and roots that they both have to Ireland. And they also spoke of the Iranian threat, and they also spoke of the future that Israel and the U.S. Can have together. President Isaac Herzog said that he wanted to see, he wanted to thank the U.S. and he wanted to see the cooperation bear fruit, and talked about a system, an ecosystem of cyclical peace here in the Middle East, talking as well about the Abraham Accords and about President Biden's next stop tomorrow after he visits East Jerusalem and Bethlehem and continues on his trip to Saudi Arabia.
All right, Bianca Zanini outside the President's house. I'll just clarify, when President Biden talked about the Irish roots that he shares with Israel's President Isaac Herzog, he's referring to the fact that President Herzog's grandfather served at one point as the chief rabbi of Ireland, and the family, and his father actually was raised in part in Ireland. His father, also former president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, actually raised part of his childhood there in Ireland. So those are the shared Irish roots that were discussed. Personal chemistry, how much of that, gentlemen, is important in actually, because certainly we have it with President Biden, and we've seen it with the Israeli leaders he has. But as you said again, Chuck, there are policy issues, particularly still on the Iran issue. It's still not clear where the Biden administration is going. Has it given up on the idea of reviving a 2015 nuclear agreement that Israel just thinks is a bad deal?
Well, I think actually the American position is quite clear. But before that, if I could just say one word, I find the pictures that we're seeing here very moving. It took the Jewish people 2,000 years to restore our national sovereignty. And here we have the president of the greatest power on earth and maybe in history, a man who defines himself as a Zionist, says it explicitly, coming and attending the opening of the Maccabiah Games, the meeting of Jewish athletes from all over the world.
I'm not sure I recall a president being at this kind of Israeli public event. Certainly President Bill Clinton came for the funeral of Shimon Peres, but actually I can't quite recall something like this.
I mean, the timing for his visit couldn't have been better. This is really a dramatic scene. But again, it's the difference between the pageantry of a presidential visit and what you were talking about as a substance. I think the American position is quite clear. The U.S. is still committed to a return to the old deal, to a diplomatic solution, is not willing to really talk and consider a plan B as Israel wants. Israel wants to talk about red lines, about what we're going to do in the various events. Well, maybe on just a purely analytical level, the administration is willing to talk about that. But to say this is what we'll do in scenario X and this is what we'll do in scenario Y, as Israel wants, that hasn't happened. I do think that one thing that will come out of this visit that is important is additional sophisticated weapons that Israel's wanted for a long time, and which will enhance its offensive capabilities should the hour arise.
Right. Again, talking about the inspiration of these pictures, we're seeing young Jews from all over the world there, some 10,000 coming for the Maccabiah Games. As I said, this is actually considered the third biggest sporting competition in a number of participants in the world after the Olympics and Special Olympics. The Maccabi, I think, founded in 1929, the first games to bring young Jews together, so it even well predates the state of Israel. So inspiring to look at that, inspiring to see the President of the United States there. Mark, you certainly had a close-up look at how prime ministers interact with U.S. presidents, Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course you served under other prime ministers as well. Let's talk about that yourself. How important is that ultimately in the end when it comes to making some of the hard decisions that we're going to be seeing made in the coming weeks?
I don't think you can exclude the personal factor. Obviously, countries run because of national interests, national security interests, economic interests, other interests, but there's also the personal factor, and you can't discount it. I think we saw that maybe at the airport at the landing ceremony yesterday, when President Biden shook hands with former Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't think that was scripted.
Right.
I even would guess that maybe some of Biden's handlers, some of his advisors would say maybe you were overly warm to the opposition leader, showing him maybe affection you didn't show other people. But the truth is the two men have known each other for some 4 decades. When Netanyahu was the deputy ambassador in Washington in the 1980s, Biden was a junior senator from Delaware, and they built a relationship, a friendship, and I saw that when I was in the Prime Minister's office, that they could disagree on different issues, but there was a personal chemistry and warmth. And when there are issues that are difficult, sometimes that chemistry can help you. I saw that in the Gaza war in 21, when Netanyahu was still in the Prime Minister's office and Biden was new in the presidency, and I saw in some of those phone conversations very delicate issues, but the friendship, the warmth can help you overcome sometimes and to understand each other better. I'm sure that's true in other cases as well, with other Israeli prime ministers and other Israeli American presidents. You can't discount the personal factor.
Right. Again, the U.S. delegation, there's been quite a bit of amount of space to that U.S. delegation. Obviously, it's usually not the case, but they're doing it for the benefit of U.S. President Joe Biden, who is there in the stands at Teddy Stadium, may or may not give remarks. We do expect Isaac Herzog to give some remarks at some time. They are now saluting. I just want to know, you mentioned the handshake yesterday at Ben Gurion Airport, but today, of course, President Biden made the point of having a meeting, a brief meeting, but a meeting nonetheless with former Prime Minister Netanyahu to try to, again, avoid at least the appearance of either interfering or impacting on the Israeli election.
We have a long history of both sides saying that, oh, God forbid, we don't intervene in the other's electoral processes, when in point of fact, both sides have done it repeatedly. But I'd like to make a point to taking off from what Mark was saying. Look, there's no doubt that Biden brings a personal warmth to this, and that it is important. It doesn't dramatically affect American policy, but maybe it pushes it a little further. I am deeply concerned that Biden may, I stress the word may, be the last of the presidents who really bring a deep internal affection or instinct towards Israel. For the most part, I believe we've now had a few generations of Americans who have grown up in the post-67 era, who look at Israel very differently from people of Biden's generation. It's no longer the heroic Israel of the early years of the rebirth, of the fight for survival against all odds, a pioneering Israel. It's an Israel which is viewed, at least by a growing part of the American electorate, as an occupier, and even worse terms are used. The relationship is excellent today, and it may stay that way. There are potential candidates on both sides who could be very good. But in the last elections, we had 3 presidential candidates, important ones, Senators Warren and Sanders, Mr. Buttigieg, who all, for the first time ever, raised the possibility of linking American military aid to a change in Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. Military aid was always the heart, the sacrosanct part of this bilateral relationship. This is now no longer a unusual position. It's becoming almost mainstream in the Democratic Party, certainly on the left wing of the party. And that's where things are heading. And as much as I think that the talk of Israel being an apartheid state is absurd and is a total misuse of the term, that is also becoming part of the discussion. I think Israel has to do a great deal in the next few years if we want to preserve what is the most important foreign relationship we have, and what is one of the fundamental pillars of Israeli national security.
Right. And Mark, you alluded to the fact that President Biden represents perhaps an older and maybe dwindling aspect of the Democratic Party, which is that strong gut support for Israel Israel. And of course, many of the younger, certainly the so-called progressive wings, but even some of the more, we think of more of being in the center. You mentioned, for example, Pete Buttigieg, who have maybe certainly don't share that same perspective on Israel in the Democratic Party.
So you're right and Chuck's right, but I think we've got to put it into perspective. All the Gallup polls show that support for Israel is up. Every year we reach a new record. We are having a problem with people on the American progressive left. I can tell you I was in Britain as ambassador during the time of Jeremy Corbyn when he was the leader of the UK Labour Party, and then there were all these stories about anti-Semitism to do with his leadership. The British Jewish community, which always stays out of the political process, was outspoken in condemning him for that. And in the middle of that crisis, at the beginning of 2019, he has a phone call with one of these progressive Democrats in the Congress, and she praises him and he praises her back like anti-Semitism wasn't important. And I think here the Democratic Party has to ask itself, what is it all about? Do these more radical extreme voices, do they speak for the Democratic Party, or does President Biden? Now, I know to a certain extent it's generational, but it's also not only generational. And I think it's important that Democrats who love Israel, who support Israel, stand up and speak loudly and condemn those who would consort with someone like Jeremy Corbyn.
Right. I just want to note, as you're speaking, gentlemen, we're looking at the the young USA team there. This generation of American Jews, look, waving the flag, coming here to Israel. Certainly, you say the polls show the general Israeli public, and certainly we're seeing how the American Jewish community is still supportive of Israel, proud to come here, though while being open to criticism and discussion about Israel. But that's certainly an inspiring sight.